Well, thank you very much. I'm very flattered to be here by the world. Thank you very much. It was a great surprise, I must tell you. Not a surprise I was getting old, but certainly a surprise to be invited to come to Colombia, where I'd never been before. I should point out to you that I'm a southerner, like many of you. I'm a South African, so I am from the southern end of the world. And I left there, I won't tell you my story of leaving there, but I left there in 1953 to get away from my parents and the politics, and came very happily to London. Now, aging is a strange business, I have to say. I look to be one of the oldest people here. Anyone above 81 in the audience? I'm the oldest one here. Well, at least it's something, that's an achievement in a sense. And it isn't possible, as you pointed out, our 17-year-old that was inside me somewhere is still really somebody who's quite young and doesn't want to really be with the old. And yet I am 81 now. And I don't know if you're familiar in Colombia as well with Shakespeare, but you know he wrote a wonderful piece called the 7 Ages of Man. Well, I changed it, although I'm an enormous fan of Shakespeare. I want to suggest there are just 4 ages. There's childhood, and then childhood, and then maturity, and then when one begins to get old, you're looking very well. It's something, well, if you're young, you say it to older people, and if you're old, everybody says it to you. And what it really means is, gosh, considering your age, you seem to be surviving. Now, there has, as been pointed out, a revolution in the number of people getting old. It really is extraordinary how much the population is now. In England now, there are more people over 65 than under 16. This has tremendous social and economic consequences which few governments, it seems to me, have taken the slightest notice of. I'll come back to this a little later. And as somebody has already pointed out, the expectation that many born today are going to reach 100 is common, whether they're right or not. One of the nice things about making predictions about age, you will not be around to find out whether you were right or not, which will die long before you. So it is a thing. And it is, certainly in the United Kingdom, that there are few of us over the age of 75 who have no health problems at all. But things aren't quite that bad. But I just want to remind you that these problems of aging go back a very long time. The oldest document about aging goes back to 2,500 years by an Egyptian called, I can't really, but Tahotep. And let me tell you what he said. How hard and painful are the last days of an aged man. He grows weaker every day. His eyes become dim. His ears deaf. His strength fades. His heart knows no peace no longer. His mouth falls silent, and he cannot speak no word. Not very encouraging, I must say. I regret to say I'm a bit familiar with some of those, but it's, we'll come back. But the idea of the problems of aging, I really want to make up, go back a very, very long time. But just let me tell you something positive. And it made the newspapers all over the United Kingdom. There have been some studies of when are people happiest. It turns out that most people are happiest in their 70s and least happy in their 40s. All right, well, I'm sorry, that's just what the surveys show, and I want to say the old were very, very pleased about that. We have no real idea why that's true, Now, aging is not a disease. It's not an illness, but it's wear and tear. It's not that different from the breakdown in your motor car. Wear and tear, and I'll come back to the details about that. And it's due to cellular damage, and I'll come back to that later. And I must say that we old people, when I meet a friend of a similar age, we say, how are you? And then we say, should we start at the top, or should we start at the bottom to discuss our problems? And we certainly have quite a lot. And there are, I must say, only as I point out, about 1 in 10 free of any problems once you're over 70. However, a very important study by a group in Britain has said that 60% of people over 80, 60% are happy with their health. Money and education helps. I'm terribly sorry, but money really does matter when you're old. And there's no point in denying this. Of course, life is terribly good, but money really matters. And I just want to point out that there are old joggers. I'm an old jogger. However, walkers can pass me when I jog. And it's one of the ways I know I know, because when I walk in the streets, everybody passes me. I can't believe it, because I think I'm walking, and it doesn't matter. Now, there are a lot. Sorry, you mean you haven't heard the word I said? That's what happened. Now, just let me tell you that with age, your brain shrinks. Doesn't mean to say we lose a lot of cells, but it does get smaller, there's no question. Muscles lose their mass, and the percentage loss in weight of your muscles every year is well documented. It's about 1% a year after the age of 40. That's the loss in the weight of your muscles. Exercise, I don't want to nag you, but exercise is absolutely fundamental. It's as important as money, I want to say. Exercise really helps with your aging enormously. And of course, not getting overweight, and I'll come back to that. Now, the main causes of death, and I want to be, nobody dies of old age. Nobody dies of old age. Just let me tell you that. Nobody dies of old age. And I'll come back to that later. The main causes of death are heart disease and cancer. And the reason why you die of heart disease is not because the cells have got bad, but you get fatty deposits in your blood vessels. That stops blood getting either to the brain or the heart, and kaput, out you go with either a stroke or a heart attack or anything else. There also, arthritis is a problem. Falls are a major problem, and I'll come back to that later. Diabetes, not good, that's also a thing. And can I just tell you, can I give you some encouraging news? As far as we know, there's no evidence that age actually prevents your sexual activities. In my case, that's not the case, I'm sorry to say, but nevertheless, the studies show that there's no reason to believe that sexual activity should really decline with age. Now, there are some amazing exceptions. There's a 73-year-old who ran a marathon. You all know what a marathon is, don't you? You have marathons in Colombia? Good, I'm glad. Well, and he ran a marathon in under 3 hours. And there's a man called Ralph Fiennes. At the age of 65, he ran 7 marathons in 7 days in 7 different countries. What about that? He also was, I think he also climbed Mount Everest too. All right, there are not many like. But there are people who really do it. And I've got a lady in London who lives literally 100 yards from me. She's 106, and spends the day playing the piano. And can I also point out to the young, who won't believe it, also to the old, there's evidence that if you have a positive view about getting old, you'll live longer. Negative views are not good. So that's the physical decline, some of the physical decline that you go through with age. But then there are the mental problems. Forgetting. And there's a lovely quote that I tell you. First you forget names, then you forget faces, then you forget to pull your zipper up, and then you forget to pull it down. I'm very forgetful. I was thinking I was getting a bit of Alzheimer's. And I came, because I suffered from depression many years ago, I see my psychiatrist for depression for 5 minutes once a month. And I was just having, you know, I was forgetting a great deal of my book. I really must ask him about it next time I go and see him. And I went to see him, and as I was cycling home, I burst out laughing. I'd forgotten to ask him. Maybe you're too young for me to forget it. And it is terrible, anyhow. But it really is really quite, it really is quite, and there's a lovely story, but not a lovely story, about, he was a well-known TV character, and he goes out for dinner on a Friday night, and he presses the bell, presses it again, and the woman puts her head out the window. Oh, he says, have I come on the wrong night? He says, no, it was last Friday, and you were here. That doesn't really get it. Did we hear Well, I'm terrible. Names and faces have gone. And I was at the book launch recently, and I got into a very nice conversation with the woman, who was enormously helpful about a book I'm writing about the differences between the two sexes. At the end of it, as I was going, I said, who are you? It was a friend of mine. A lot of old people have been very successful. Galileo was still brilliant at old age, and so was Churchill. There are lots of old chess players who do very well. And these things just, but when it comes to mental problems, there is nothing to compare with dementia. Dementia is where you begin to forget a lot of things, and you really can't remember. So am I demented? No. You were there, yes. Not too bad. But dementia is very serious, and Alzheimer's is an absolute nightmare. There are over 800,000 people in the United Kingdom with Alzheimer's. It is really a terrible, terrible illness. And it's due to cell death in the nervous system. It's not very well understood. The story is, or people have shown, that there's a block of protein called amyloid, which attaches to nerve cells in the brain and kills them in the skin. But it's controversial. I mean, there are articles all the time now about the nature of Alzheimer's. Also, compared to cancer, it's a very under-researched field. You can't compare the effort put into cancer with that that's being put into Alzheimer's. But it really is a terror. And people who have to look after someone with Alzheimer's are an absolute nightmare. Also, people with Alzheimer's can be very aggressive and very, very unpleasant. It really is hard. Also, I have to tell you, there's a particular gene called ApoE, which increases your chance of getting Alzheimer's. But nobody really knows what the cause of Alzheimer's is or how to prevent it. Exercise. Exercise, don't think money, maybe intellectual, the blunt answer is we really don't. So there are quite a lot of negative things about getting old, but there really are some really quite pleasant things. And Somerset Maugham said, old age has its pleasures, which, though different, are not less than the pleasures of youth, and that's very nice. Now, I'm a friend of Joan Baker. You've never heard of Joan. Joan is a friend of mine, very good looking woman. She's now about 79, and she was appointed by the government to be the spokesman, or the spokeswoman for aging. And she takes a very positive view about the pleasures still in her life. She's continually making new friends, many of whom are much younger than her. And it's quite curious that many of those of us who are 75 and older, not you and me, but many over 75, really don't think of themselves as old. It's a curious business which is not well understood as what determines when we really believe that we are old. And there are people who really quite enjoy being old. Have you ever heard of a very famous psychologist called Skinner? Very, very famous, studies psychology. His daughter lives next door to my apartment, and so she gave me one of his books. And one of the reasons he liked being old was, as he said, I no longer have to be nice to people. And then I have friends. I have a friend called Mitchison, who's 91, works at a medical school, is still doing experiments and publishing papers and doing extremely well at 91. I just met one of my cousins who's 96 and lives in Boston. And I said to him, you're looking very well, which he is. He says he is a little slow, but nevertheless he's doing fine. And when I say to him, how much longer do you want to go on? He says, I'm happy to leave now. His main problem with aging, and I'll come back to it, he cannot stand the younger people patronizing him, and keep on talking in a simple way on the assumption that he will not understand. There are, of course, in Britain, we have the University of the Third Age. Do you have anything like that in this country? That is, it's a university for older people. And that's really quite good. You have it, you have it. And there is also a problem. Sorry, not coming through. Can you hear me? Okay. There is the University of the Third Age in the United Kingdom, which is very good for people. Not that many. One of the problems, I think, with the old is they're bad about computers. It says that there really not many old people ever get onto the internet. Now, I'm old, I don't know how they can survive. I live on the internet. I'll be absolutely honest. In fact, the way I spend my day, now that I'm retired, is I lie on my bed with my computer on my tummy, typing away and looking up. And there's a funny way to do it, but that's the way it is. The other advantage of being old is grandchildren. Grandchildren can be very nice. And looking after grandchildren can be nice. However, there is evidence that children who are looked after by their grandchildren do worse than those who are looked after properly at the junior school or something like that. The reasons aren't clear. So you've just got to be a little careful about giving your children to their grandparents to be looked after. Of course, another lovely thing is you can have pets. I'm longing to have a dog again, but my partner's not very keen. I am, in fact, her dog, so there is a dog in the family, in a sense. But pets can really help the old ignorance. Also, the old prefer country life to urban life, certainly, and I'm sure that's probably true in Colombia. But a major, major problem with the old is loneliness. About 500,000 people in Britain spend Christmas all alone, and loneliness is really hard for the old and the retirement. Oh, I could give, somebody else could give a whole lecture on retirement. It's a major, major problem. First of all, you don't have a job anymore, but also you don't earn money. And so if you don't have a decent pension, and I did tell you money really matters, it's really, very tricky. And there is a very good charity. There is a very, very good charity in the UK. I don't know if you have the charities here. There's a charity called Age UK in Britain, which is absolutely first rate and does a great deal of research into aging and trying to persuade the government to do something about it. Another peculiarity is there are a lot of old prisoners in jail. The number of old, old people committing crimes and going to prison is surprising. Maybe because they're old, they must have good at getting away with it. And that's why they're maybe so. The answer is we don't know. And as I say, I in my old age will retire, and there I spend my. I miss my scientific group. I really do. And I've tried to write books now, lying on my bed with my computer on my time. Now, the question is, what about doing something about it? Groucho Marx has a nice remark. Getting older is no problem. You just have to live long enough. So then, I hope you like Groucho. Now, the first person to really think seriously in a semi-scientific way about aging was Hippocrates in Greece. And he thought it was due to the loss of heat and water. He hadn't a clue, of course. Then a British scientist called Roger Bacon in 1214, it's a long time after Hippocrates, he said exercise and a good diet. But he also suggested that the breath of young virgins could prevent you aging. What an attractive suggestion. However, it was only with Francis Bacon in 1630s who really took a scientific view of aging, but he didn't make much progress, but at least in time. The first really important scientific concept about aging came from August Weismann in 1881, and it was based on Darwinian ideas. And he thought that it was an evolution had selected us to age so that we would die off and there wouldn't be too many people. He thought that was aging was about. Of course, he's quite wrong. Yes, he's quite wrong. He also pointed out that eggs and sperm, that is germ cells, must not age because that would be disastrous for the next generation. I'll come back to that. And then we came to Peter Medawar, who said really it was genetic. And that, well, I'll come back to that in a moment. And Hayflick put some cells from the skin of people in culture. And he found that if you put cells like mine in culture, they divide only a certain number of times. If you took a younger person, they divide more times. And that was a very important discovery. And then they did lead this led, of course, to trying to understand aging in terms of evolution. As I've already pointed out, aging is not a disease. And aging is not like growth in any way at all. I mean, we all evolve. We get older, we grow, we go through puberty. That's got nothing to do with aging whatsoever. That's simply normal development with age. And as I already pointed out, nobody dies of old age. You die of diseases that may have been triggered by old age. And what Medawar pointed out was that mutations that occur after you damage to your cells, after you've reproduced, evolution doesn't care about it. Can I just remind you, evolution is only interested in you for one thing. Sorry, reproduction. It doesn't care if you're happy, it doesn't care if you're healthy, it doesn't care if you're good looking, it doesn't care if you're rich, unless these affect your reproduction. So it's only reproduction that evolution cares about. And so with wear and tear, evolution doesn't mind wear and tear, so long as it can be controlled before your reproductive phase is over and you've looked after your children. And this led to the very nice concept. There's a model called the disposable soma model by someone called Tom Kirkwood. That is, you only prevent aging until you're reproduced, and then bye-bye, dolly green. It doesn't care about that. And an interesting question is, why do women get a menopause? Why at a particular age? Men can go on reproducing fast and forever. But why is there a menopause? It's not fully understood. But one view is that you want to stop women having babies when they're about 50, so that they can devote their time to looking after the children. So it's really, that's what the model is. You don't like it. And I'm sorry, that's the best model. And the oldest mother that's ever been recorded was 70. But that's very good. But it does make sense. You really want, if you want children to survive, parents and grandparents are going to look after them. And if they're going to have more children, that's not going to happen. Then what is really happening in the cells as we age? Now, do remember, you are nothing more than a society of cells. Sorry to tell you everything you do is determined by your cells. That's all it is. And the cells in the cells, there are the genes. Genes are very, very boring. They don't do anything. But they're like telephone numbers. They code for proteins. And what determines how cells behave is what proteins you have in your cells. And which genes are turned on, phoned up, determine which proteins are there. And so it's proteins that really matter. And what happens with aging, there's protein damage, the DNA is damaged, and therefore it leads to faulty proteins. And it's because of the proteins that the cells are damaged. Now, it's interesting that how our cells deal with it. There's a process called autophagy. You never heard of it. You never heard of autophagy before? Well, some of you have. Cells can get rid of some of the damaged material inside them. They can spit it out and get rid of it. And also certain cancer cells, if they're badly altered, certain potential cancer cells, if the cells that are damaged and might give rise to cancer, the cell will commit suicide. And that can happen also. And what's striking is that individual cells like yeast and bacteria also age. And studies on yeast have discovered a particular protein called sirtuins, which actually are involved in the aging process. Now, the main studies on aging have not been on humans, but they've been on some simple organisms, like the fruit fly, which lives for about 30 days, the nematode worm, which only lives for just 20 days, and then it dies because its muscles deteriorate. Nobody knows why its muscles should deteriorate after about 15 days, but that's what happens. And studies on these organisms have revealed a great deal about aging. The most important is they have discovered a pathway in these organisms linked to insulin, which if you block this pathway, you'll live longer. You can make it really a thing. And if you limit to food, for example, in something like a worm, instead of living for 15 days, it will live for 90 days. So it's an interesting question which I'll come back to. as to whether you stop eating, you will live to old age. There are also, at the ends of your chromosomes, a structure called telomeres. These are bits of DNA at the ends of your chromosomes, and every time a cell divides, this is chopped off. And if it's all chopped off, the cell won't divide again. But there's an enzyme called telomerase which puts it back on. And there's evidence that if you've got good telomeres, if you've got nice long telomeres, there is a study on some Ashkenazi Jews, they're all of whom have telomeres, they're living a bit longer. Nobody knows why, but that's the way it is. And it's worth remembering. I just need a glass of water, I'm dying of thirst, sorry. Just give me sorry. Thanks very much. Oh. If you think of twins, hold on. Identical twins do not die at the same age. It's a very big difference. Only about 30% of your lifespan is determined by your genes. So it's the way you live and random changes that determine how long you'll live. And there are organisms that don't age, organisms like Hydra. Then, if we come back now to the question, sorry, I'm just beginning to feel a little tired. Do you mind, would it be possible for me to sit down and use one of these mics? I'm terribly sorry. Sorry about that. We old men. Oops. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Yes. Is it okay? No. Is that better? No. Sorry about that. Now, it's claimed that most of us want to live to a very old age. And those of you who do, you must remember the Greek legend. There was a young Greek called Tithonus. And Zeus's daughter, Aurora, was madly in love with Tithonus. And she asked her father to make him immortal. And of course, said Zeus, I'll make him immortal. And he became immortal. But Zeus hadn't prevented him aging, and he became a terribly battered old man, and I think ended up as a grasshopper. So if you want to live longer, that's fine, but for goodness sake, you've got to do something about aging. And there are all sorts of stories in the literature. Jonathan Swift has a wonderful story about the struddlebugs who live to a very old age and who are very, very unhappy. Because you've got to stop the aging process. Now, how old can people live? Sorry, I'm an atheist, so I don't take the Bible terribly seriously. So Adam living to 930, nonsense, sorry. However, the oldest person that we are quite sure of who lived the longest is a woman called Calment, a French woman, who lived till the age of 122. It's amazing. The oldest man is 115. There are hundreds of stories about people living longer than this, or as long. And the Guinness Book of Records says that of all the problems it has in finding out reliable stories for their records, those related to aging are the most common. It's people have millions of stories about people very, very getting old. And people always want to find ways of preventing getting old. I like the breath of young virgins, you know. Unfortunately, I don't think you can get that on the health service. But there are many others. Winston Churchill, had goat gonads pushed up his external exterior. People will do all sorts of things in order to get to continue things. Now, calorie restriction, as I mentioned, is the thing. With rats, if you give them less food, they'll age 50% more. However,
there's very little evidence that humans will age significantly more if they have a low diet. And that to have a very low diet is maybe you can eat one hamburger a day. I mean, it really is tricky. However, on the island of Okinawa, the Japanese have a tradition of eating very little, and they've got a lot of very old people there. And then that's one aspect of living longer. But there is the other of preventing looking old. I'm sorry, this is mainly a female issue. And I want to say the cosmetics industry, I think it's something like $57 billion or more a year. And of course, as Oscar Wilde said, to get back to my youth, I would do anything in the world except take exercise, get up early, or be respectable. But that's the thing. So even Cleopatra was putting a gold ointment on her face. Women really do try to prevent looking old. And it's a very interesting question as to why sex or youth is so sexually attractive. This is a tricky issue and it's not fully understood. But on the whole, I would argue that from an evolutionary point of view, is if you're looking beautiful, it means you're healthier. And in fact, there is some studies that's saying that your risk of having an autoimmune disease is much less if you're looking pretty. It's an interesting, that's another story altogether. And of course, there are many people, women who take Botox, and I think it does help them. But I think many of the creams that are claimed, you know, to get rid of all your wrinkles and so forth, I would treat it with great caution and great suspicion. And of course, there is the lovely story of Dorian Gray, if you remember in the Oscar Wilde story, that he had a portrait painted of him. And the portrait aged, and he remained young. And of course, when he died, the portrait, he took on all the characters of the portrait. And then there's the question, well, how does one treat the aging? Amongst the Greeks, Plato was very positive about the old. Aristotle was very negative about them. There's a very long history about this whole thing. And in more recent time, W.B. Yeats and I think they were thinking. And most people, and there is this sort of slightly patronizing view, the old are treated as warm and incompetent. I'm neither warm, no, or well, I'm a bit incompetent, but not terribly. I don't really like it. And as I've already pointed out, Trotsky dreaded getting old. And can I point out that I have a relative everywhere because my first wife's great uncle was Trotsky. If you look on TV, it's claimed that only 3% of the characters you see on TV are over 65. So there really is quite severe discrimination against the old when it comes to the media. And I really think that there's also quite a lot amongst politicians, and there's quite good evidence that people really don't want to have old politicians around. They're supposed to be wiser, but on the other hand. There is, yes, I think that's true. There's also quite a lot of mistreating of the old. There's quite a lot of abuse. There's about 500,000 cases of abuse of the elderly in the United Kingdom. And we'll come in a moment to the problem of medical care and care homes, which in Britain at the moment really is in the paper every day and is a major, major problem. So how should the old and how can the old be cared for? And as H.L. Mencken said, old age is no place for sissies. I think he's right. It's quite tricky if you're, once again, if you're healthy and you've got money, it's okay. But if you're not healthy and you haven't got money, you've got a real problem. in Britain, to live in a care home costs £24,000 a year. I presume there are care homes in Colombia. I haven't looked into it. You've got care homes here? You do. I bet they're expensive too. Well, I don't know. But this is a problem, and where is the money going to come from? And there's the whole question of how the old are really going to live. There are also, in Britain, 6 million carers of the old, relatives and friends, who earn nothing but look after the old. It's a major problem. And most of the old prefer to stay at home and do not want to be in a care home. There's also a terrible problem that 1/3 of those over 85 have problems with stairs. You know, these are real problems. And there was a television program in which Michael Parkinson had actually looked at care homes, and he ended up comparing them. He said that care homes are effectively like waiting rooms for death. Now, I know that's quite spooky. I mean, I know they try hard, but the people in the care homes aren't treated that well. And there is quite a lot now at the moment. There's story after story in the paper about neglect of the old in care homes, and how the people who are looking after the old in care homes are simply not trained in any way about how to do it. And there's also the problem in the UK, perhaps not here, that in winter, the poor old don't have enough money to warm their homes, and this leads to very, very severe problems. And one must remember that the increase, as somebody pointed out in one of the speeches, that the increase in the number of the old has virtually nothing to do with some clever way of preventing aging. It's due to hygiene and better living. And there's very little evidence of any treatment that can prevent you aging. There is a man called Aubrey de Grey who has written a book claiming he thinks that we can soon all be made immortal by molecular biology. I've never heard such nonsense. And can I remind you that someone who really wanted to make people immortal would probably have to change their genes, and that would have to be done in the egg. So you want people to live to 120, you make molecular changes. But if you did it, you'd never know whether it worked, because you die long before that happened. And there's really very little evidence that we know how to increase. Well, a little calorie restriction will do a little bit. Also, it was what I was thinking about. It was last night when I couldn't sleep, I came up with the idea. It's quite interesting to realize that germ cells, eggs and sperm, don't age. And I realized why they don't. They don't do anything. They just sit there waiting to become an egg or a sperm. So it's quite unlike your muscles or your nerve. I think it's jolly clever. I thought of it in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep. They don't do anything, and if you don't do anything, you won't age. So I think that's really quite a thing. So the question then is, what do you really do when you are old? It's the thing, and what are the governments really going to do? Well, this is an issue that's really got to be discussed with governments, about care homes, pensions, and what money. If you've got more than £24,000 in assets in Britain, you'll get no further benefits whatsoever. And then there's, when you're getting old and you're approaching death, what should be done? And I want to promote death with dignity. I think it is monstrous that old people who have an incurable disease and want to die peacefully and comfortably and preferably in their own home are not allowed to do so by law. I regard this as monstrous. I think we all have the right to choose our own death when we want to. All right, you should say depressives shouldn't. You know, you want a doctor to make sure that it's not that someone's just going through a bad patch. But if someone can rationally point out that they're not going to get better and that they've really had enough, I think that they should have the right to have a very, very peaceful death. So I'm very, very supportive of this. and I'm a patron of something, of an organization called Dignity in Death, and I hope that something will eventually happen with this. And just let me finish then with a nice poem by Jonathan Swift that goes back 300 years ago. I won't read it all, but just a little bit. So he wrote what he thought you should do when you were old, or not to do. Not to marry a young woman. Not to keep young company unless they really desire it. Not to be peevish or morose or suspicious. Not to scorn present ways or wits or fashions. Not to be fond of children or let them come near me hardly. Not to tell the same story over and over again. Thank you very much indeed.